Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to this event discussing the new book by Elyse Semerdjian, Embodied Archives, Remnants, Embodied Archives of the Armenian Genocide. I'm Melanie McAllister. I am the director of the Institute for Middle East Studies at GW, and it's my pleasure to introduce both our speaker and our commentator today, and I'll jump right in and do that so we can get started hearing about the book. Dr. Semerdjian is a social historian of the Ottoman Empire whose research focuses on the experiences of women and the empire's Armenian subjects. She's authored Off the Straight Path, Illicit Sex, Law, and Community in Ottoman Aleppo, that came out in 2008, and Remnants, Embodied Archives of the Armenian Genocide, which came out in 2023, and was the winner of the Association for Middle East Women's Studies Prize and the Institute for the Study of Genocide Raphael Lemkin Best Book Prize Awards. She received her MA in Middle East Studies from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and her PhD in History from Georgetown University, our friendly rival down the street. She has served as the Dumanian Visiting Professor in Armenian Studies in the Department of Near East Cultures and Languages at the University of Chicago, and was awarded the Cornell University Society for the Humanities Fellowship in 2016. In 2023-24, she received a German research grant with the Religion and Urbanity Research Group at the University of Erfurt, Germany, to support new research projects on Aleppo, serving both the Strassler Center and the History Department at Clark University. Semerdjian teaches Armenian history, including the history of the Armenian Genocide, and a mix of courses on gender, the Middle East, and the Ottoman Empire. We're very excited to have you here today to talk about your book. After she speaks, she'll have some comments and interaction with Nefertiti Takla, who is an assistant professor at Georgetown University, who specializes in the social and cultural history of modern Egypt with a focus on gender and sexuality. Her research interests include the role of race and gender in the historical development of capitalism, transnational discourses of crime and criminality, labor migration in the Mediterranean world, gendered violence, and global feminisms. Her first book manuscript, Raya and Sakina, Femicide and the Coloniality of Gender in Egypt, analyzes how wartime colonial exploitation led to a major femicide in northern Egyptian cities in the early interwar era, and how the coloniality of gender shaped its prosecution and popular portrayals of that femicide. Thank you for being here, Nefertiti, and we're looking forward to having your comments. I will let you two begin. Elyse, you will start, and after you've had a chance to talk for a while, Nefertiti will jump in. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Melanie, for such a lovely introduction. I want to extend my gratitude to the Institute for Middle East Studies, and especially to my commentator, Nefertiti, for taking the time to comment on my work today. And thank you to Christian for the logistics. I'm going to try to share my screen here. I hope that this is working. Is it in presentation mode? Hopefully.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, you're good.
I'm a little technologically challenged, although sometimes it doesn't look quite like that. But this afternoon, I want to introduce you to my book, Remnants, Embodied Archives of the Armenian Genocide, where I explore how gender and the body figured centrally in the minds of not only perpetrators, but the minds of global humanitarians who set out to rescue and recuperate Armenian victims. The through line of the book examines post-memory of the Armenian Genocide and how the uprooting of the Ottoman Empire's Armenian population from their ancestral homelands in Anatolia, or what is today modern Turkey, is remembered as a body horror. It's a memory of dismemberment, a memory of tattooed skin, and memory of the bones of martyrs. So Remnants analyzes fragmentary evidence of Armenian survivors, paying special attention to the traces that violence has left on the body of the archive and on the actual bodies of Armenian victims and their descendants, if we think of traumatic memory as another form of marking. The embodied trauma of victims of sexual abuse and forced marriage have at times been deemed too personal or too emotional to be worthy of historical study. Women's bodies themselves are treated here as historical evidence through engagement with a number of interdisciplinary fields while reading memoirs, letters, newspapers, biographies, oral histories, ethnography, photography, and film across a dozen archives in 7 different languages, which are not all mine. I did elicit help, especially Danish. It's a language I will never study, unfortunately. But the stories of sexual violence, while central to the objectives of genocide, are often relegated to a single-page mention within existing historiography. They're just not worth even analyzing. And this is true even though women constituted the majority of victims, as the population was intentionally feminized through the elimination of men, or most men, at the outset. By highlighting these ciphered bits of information, or what I call remnants, and of course Remnants is playing on Holocaust historiography, as well as an Armenian tradition of thinking about remnants in Armenian post-genocide literature. I situate the body of survivors as a repository of traumatic experience. Bodies themselves form also sites of resistance where memory of victims are preserved by their descendants through these embodied rituals and post-memory practices that I detail in the last part of the book. And my touchstone is, of course, post-memory, thinking about Marianne Hirsch's work. And one of her more recent works with Leo Spitzer has this great quotation that helps us think about how second or even third-hand memories are experienced as if they are first-hand memories. And this happens frequently in the writings of Armenians about the genocide, as if they're experiencing these moments in 1915 firsthand. The quote is, "These events were transmitted to them, the survivor community, so deeply and effectively so as to seem to constitute memories in their own right. Post-memory's connection to the past is thus mediated not by recall, but by imaginative investment, projection, and creation." And so I hope to be able to offer you at least a couple of examples of this. I take post-memory and I use the term prosthetic memory, which ties some of these memory practices, especially bone collecting, which is the third part of the book, to think about Armenian bone collecting rituals, which all Armenians know about and people who've encountered Armenians know about, but it hasn't really been analyzed as to what the practice is doing for the community. And that's something I'm trying to detail in this book, and I use the term prosthetic memory to connect these ritual practices that are also embodied. They're taking place in the desert. It's hot, it's uncomfortable, the climate is uncomfortable, and people are going out and collecting the bones of their bones that they believe are of their ancestors who were killed in those areas. They could be also other bones, as I detail. Other people have died in mass in those areas, but it's connecting it to ancient Christian practices that include embodied ritual like the Eucharist, the self-flagellation, fasting. And it's not by mistake that Armenians also use that language to describe the bone collection, that the bones are called masukner in Armenian, which means relics. So they're actually referring to the bones of those who died in 1915 as relics. That connects it to these kind of embodied rituals of the past. So I wanted to offer some chronology. I won't dwell on it, but I do think it's important to talk about the timeline, and you could use a different timeline like 1915 to the present, since genocide is a process, and denial and erasure is sort of the last stage, and Armenians have been experiencing that even up to the present. But I'm saying 1915 to 1923 to talk about sort of a re-engineering of spaces where Armenians lived in this time period, where the population is being pushed out through arrest and disappearance, first of Armenian intellectuals on April 24th, which is in 1915, but today is also understood as a day of commemoration for Armenians internationally, where they remember the disappearance of these intellectuals and politicians, but also in general commemorate the genocide. And then you have a series of laws, including in May 1915, where there's relocation and resettlement, which is code for murder, since so many people never even were able to leave their villages or their cities. So the idea of relocation becomes a code name for murder. excuse me, I refer to genocide's bodywork because I read these processes through a gendered lens, through thinking about sexual atrocity and the purpose it is playing in order to unravel the Armenian community. How there's abduction and forced conversion of women and children, but for women in particular, there's forced marriage, concubinage, and even forms of slavery. One woman's memoir that I'm working on now talks about slave auctions are happening in real time inside these relocation caravans of Armenians marching for hundreds of miles. There are actually ad hoc auctions taking place inside those caravans. And these women and children formed a source of surplus labor, if you want to think of it in a Marxist sense. They become domestic labor in the household. But then we also have a focus on the body with regard to rescue and recuperation. There's a huge archive of visual culture that really gives us a sense that Armenians are being reformed. Their looks are being polished up for the camera and projected to humanitarians across the world to show proof that rehabilitation has taken place. And of course, a lot of this rehabilitation is racialized and gendered, since there was a hyper focus on women and also a focus on women, Armenians as white, in order to make them worthy subjects of recuperation. So the book is structured in 3 parts. The first part, I talk about body snatching, which is the actual taking of bodies and this kind of trafficking, if you will, in women and children, as the League of Nations called it at the time. But it's also about dismembering or ripping apart society. The national pattern, as Raphael Lemkin called it, is being unraveled through this process. Then we also have reclamation and recuperation found under bodies. I'm interested in looking critically at the representation of Armenians in humanitarian photography and film, experimental film. Not all films survived, but some have in fragments, and then some I think are also still not known to everyone, especially some Danish experimentations with humanitarian film. And then I moved to skin and tattoos and post-memory. Tattooed Armenian women, although not all of them received it, has been a lingering post-memory for Armenians that I wanted to unpack and unsettle in order to try to reframe the discourse, maybe unsuccessfully, but I'm trying to sort of address how it is that tattoos are racialized and troubled the idea of the Armenian as a white, worthy subject of humanitarian rescue. And then I'm also very interested in tattoo anthropology, because the tattoos have their own universe in which they have radically different meanings than what the Armenians tend to think they mean. For Armenians, they are virtual, or they're actually veritable wounds. They are the wounding of the nation. They are symbols of forcible assimilation. And I try to open the meaning to show sort of a whole universe of possibilities, so that perhaps we could view these women as survivors instead of thinking of their tattoos as residue of sexual violence, which is typically how it's understood in the community. And then finally, I talk about this bone collecting practice that I detailed to you a moment ago, and it's really focused on Deir ez-Zor. Although there are more areas of mass killing inside Syria, Deir ez-Zor becomes synonymous with the Armenian genocide in Armenian post-memory, and there's copious writing on this subject. So just to give you a small glimpse of thinking about bodies, you know, I'm a critic of the Ottoman archives, although I use them frequently in my work. I've become more critical of them only because when you look at what an abducted girl looks like in the Ottoman archive, what you see is absolute effacement. This is a girl who was deported on one of those caravans that I mentioned. And we learned that a captain, a Jemdar, Niyazi Effendi, took this Armenian girl as a bride for himself by force during the relocation. Basically, during the genocide, he picked a girl off for himself and married her without her consent. She is trying to leave this marriage to go to her mother's household, despite not daring to do so. This is taking place in 1919, and it's one of many attempts of women and community members to release women and children from homes, because by treaty, these women were supposed to be returned to their community. But what's really disturbing to me is the woman doesn't even get a name. And what we have is really a kind of an unsettled case, because from the framework of a patriarchal marriage, this woman really doesn't have much recourse. I mean, she is now a wife, and that sort of changes her status in the eyes of the law. So it's very difficult for these women to get released from these homes, even though at this time we have an allied armistice that should be enforcing it. And of course, they did do much to enforce these releases. At the same time, if we look at that kind of effacement in that example, we can see something very different. And for me as a researcher, this is kind of the gem that you hope to find in an archive, which is a letter from a woman in Raqqa named Kaghanoush, who is trying to help get her father to help her get released from a house that she is forcibly coupled with a Muslim Arab. And here she talks about how she's already received a letter from him. So we learn that these captive women are also having correspondences with their loved ones. And she says, there's a lot of religious rhetoric here. I was happy to receive your letter. Praise the Lord. Through his infinite favor, he rescued us from our enemies. Father, when I was made aware that you were alive, I felt so happy. And then poetically, she says, I wish I had the wings of a bird to fly and come to you. So she says at this point she has two children. One is Nazareth, which is from her Armenian husband before the deportation, and the other is from the Arab. So in this case, the child of the Arab gets like no name. It tells us a lot about a different kind of effacement that's happening here, but the Arab child is one that she doesn't seem to be claiming in the same way. I wanted to come to Aleppo, but my son's father's not here and I have no money. So I begged my father to free me from this Arab. This was archived just by kind of chance by a rescuer of Armenians. And we don't have any resolution whether she was able to leave. But what we do know is there were vast networks to help women like her leave her situation clandestinely in the region. And because I was told to keep my remarks brief, I'm going to move very quickly to skin. I do start my book with an analysis of Lutfi Belamjian, who is a woman whose text is really describing how she went to Deir Zor, where I mentioned before is where Armenians perform rituals. It's synonymous with the killing fields. She ends up in Ras Al Ain and Deir Zor, which were very difficult places to survive. And what's amazing is that her photograph really perfectly preserves her tattoos, which allows me to actually glean more information about her. I would just say, for the sake of time, two things. She's incredibly well dressed, and there were many people who arrived so disheveled, in a state of disarray, but she is wearing very traditional clothing, seems to have pulled her cloak up over her head for modesty, for the photograph. But her tattoos, she's not only well dressed, but her tattoos are accentuated by the clothing, which I think is telling. I mean, a woman who might feel perhaps more shame might not want to emulate some of the motifs on her face, on her dress. And a lot of these clothes are actually of their own design. So a lot of women had a hand in designing their own clothing, if not stitching it themselves. But the motifs on her face also tell another part of the story that's not in the written record, which is that she's bearing the motifs of the Anaza tribe. That was a very predatory tribe in the Deir Zor region, Ras Al Ain region. And so part of the story that's not narrated by text is actually narrated on her face, namely the group that likely grabbed her first were the Anaza, who marked her as belonging to that tribe. Now, not all tattoos have tribal signification. The one on the my right hand side, maybe your left, the chevrons, which are going down her neck, are actually called budai, and they are wheat chaff. And the wheat is a symbol of fertility. So many of these symbols are sometimes agricultural, but are sort of representing fertility, rites of passage, since a lot of these women received these tattoos at the time of puberty. And lastly, it's important to say that not all Armenian women receive these tattoos, but it does become a question when these Armenian women try to re-enter Armenian society. They're wearing markings that basically proclaim them as belonging to another group. Their skin itself has been assimilated. So we start to see experimentation with tattoo removal surgery, and I detail some of those techniques. Some women received them, but it was extremely expensive to get. So finally, with bones, I would just say, we're talking about an unmarked necrogeography, meaning, we have people like Peter Balakian, who has called Deir Zor, which is at the bottom in the Syrian desert, the bottom of the map. He's called Deir Zor like what Auschwitz is for the Armenians. However, it's not a clearly demarcated space. It only received its first monuments in 1990. So I start back in with some of the first references of Armenian rituals out there in around 1919 and move up towards the creation of a monument. And that's the story I seek to tell here. And I have some rudimentary maps. There's been no formal excavation of these sites. I know there's at least one person who's perfectly equipped for this excavation, but he did start it in 2007, and the excavation was closed down in 4 days by the Syrian government. So it's very difficult to conceive of how an excavation would take place, but know that there are people who are hopeful that they would go out and perform a scientific excavation. I moved in a more effective direction, giving up really on empiricism when it comes to this space, to think more about post-memory and to think about how people feel when they go there. This is an Armenian Ottoman parliamentarian who visited there in 1930, and this is a very iconic photograph. It may be staged. I mean, there is a femur sticking out of the ground, but it's an iconic photograph that models for us how we witness in Deir Zor. We have many writings. This is Gangamahedor with a skull by Hamasdeh, and Hamasdeh is writing about the skull he himself collected, and you can see a representation of it here by Minas Minasian, an artist who drew this amazing graphic. He's having a conversation, and the bones sort of come to life and speak to him, and also speak of the identities they once belonged to. In his imagination, I should go back, he imagines them as being men. And so there's something really remarkable about bones that allow people to imagine different genders or different roles, different persona. And so in that way, it goes back to post-memory as being like a deep projection of the self onto the bones, onto the patina of the bones, if you will. And this is a very important excavation. I was able to find the diary of the man in the hole, Haratun Hovakimian, and here he's holding a smaller skull. It may in fact be a child. This was allegedly, according to the museum that has this original photograph, this site was at the base of the Deir Zor bridge, where many Armenian orphans were marched out of the city and murdered. So these bones were collected on this expedition, but not for science so much as for creating a shrine. The shrine will eventually be erected in Lebanon. So he packed up more than 30 boxes and shipped them to Lebanon. And I detail this mission of Hovakimian to collect bones so that a proper monument could be created in another country. Finally, and these are my last slides, the Holy Martyrs Church and Armenian Genocide Memorial was finally created in 1990 by the Archbishop of Aleppo. And it was very important for him that there be a site in Deir Zor for pilgrims to go to. So on the top, there's the church, and this is also a ceremony on April 24th. So you can see people gathered on April 24th, and I interviewed people who went there. They would quickly get on buses and go home. So sometimes spending 14 hours or more on the ride to get there, only to have a few hours ceremony and get ready to go home again. And this is very much a regional practice of Armenians in Syria and Lebanon primarily, to go to the site. After Peter Balakian, the Pulitzer Prize-winning poet, writes some essays about bones in around 2007, 2008, more attention is given to the site, and we start to see more people going from outside of the region, from the United States, from Europe, even from Turkey. I interviewed some Turks who actually went as a result of this publicity given to the site. But unfortunately, and this is my last slide, in 2014, the site was destroyed. At the time, the city was controlled by Islamic State. And if you are paying attention to the news today, you would know that the site is now being subsumed under government control. So we have now more Syrian state control, but a new government. And so there's a lot of uncertainty about, will the monument be rebuilt? There was an attempt for a delegation to go and investigate the matter about 6 years ago, but the entire delegation was gunned down when they entered the city. So there are Islamic State sleeper cells that have very strong viewpoints, as you might imagine, about this site, and you know, it's not clear what exactly is influencing their perspective, that they're so against Armenians entering the city or the idea of rebuilding, but we could gather that there might be some changes in the region with regard to how hospitable it would be to building a new monument. I also raised one last issue, which is a lot has happened in Deir Zor. When Islamic State took over the region, there was the mass killing of the Shaitat tribe, a Sunni Muslim tribe. They were killed, you know, in the hundreds and maybe even more than thousands when they took over the city. So there's bone on bone, and there's a lot of now new memories of mass killing, including the mass killing of Yazidis. There's at least 22 mass graves between Deir Zor and Mosul, Iraq, of Yazidis. So that is to say that memorialization perhaps should take on a new character in light of everything that's happened in Syria. So I'm hoping to be part of those conversations in the future. And that is the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Elyse. Oh, sorry,
Right.
Melanie, are you going to say something?
I'm just going to say to everyone, thank you for that. And also, if you don't know, you can ask your questions in the Q&A section here on Zoom. And then Nefertiti will also, you know, host taking those questions at the end. So use that for any questions that you have. Okay, bye.
Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here today discussing one of my favorite books. Elyse, as I'm speaking, maybe if you could mute, just because I think that might help with the echo. Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. So I'm really honored to be here today discussing one of my favorite books. Thank you to both Elyse and to the Institute for Middle East Studies at George Washington for bringing us together today. Elyse, this is one of the most moving, beautifully written, innovative, and bold academic books I have ever read. One of my favorite lines in the book is, "This book is a dare," and in it, I suggest that the body is a text, and that in turn, a book may take the shape of a traumatized body. You did this a little bit in your introduction, but can you tell us how the various parts of the book, entitled Bodies, Skin, and Bones, remembers the dismembered bodies of genocide survivors?
Thank you. And thank you again for your willingness to engage in this conversation. Well, I mean, the remembering it, you know, to play around with words, that kind of reassembling is something I see happening in Deir Zor, which is why very late I decided to add the third part of the book. It was originally just going to be about the body, but it felt that the bones were an important part of the story, in the sense that when the women I interviewed who, for example, stand on what used to be the Deir Zor suspension bridge, it's gone now, they would sort of imagine women flinging themselves off the bridge to escape soldiers. There's copious amounts of writing, or even just, again, the oral histories that I collected where people are detailing, having this kind of, I don't know, like a kind of a moment where they feel connected to the past. But there's also, I think, this reassembling of community that happens through these interactions, mostly the taking of bones, which is not something every Armenian did, but many do actually take bone remnants with them, is just a way of materially grasping the past. But it's also, the bones allow them to imagine themselves part of a larger community. And so I use Jean-Luc Nancy to his theory to think about communities in being. Death is also a state of being. There's a reason why we care for the dead the way we do, because we also see them as an extension of our community. And their memory also embeds them within that kind of long, extended life of a community. So I see all of these things, whether it's the creative writing that happens, where people are kind of empathically, almost viscerally embodying the people who died there, but at the same time collecting those remnants. And that does indeed gross people out, and it's okay that people are repulsed by it. I'm also interested in the repulsion part. But it also, for others, they're creating ad hoc ossuaries in their home, and they're creating memorials in their home in a place, where if you went to Deir Zor today, you wouldn't find any markings. There's nothing today, nothing, zero. Just the rubble where two monuments were built in the region. So that work, it takes on a new dimension, I think, in light of the violence, the attempt to erase the memorials too. And of course, Turkish state denial of the Armenian Genocide, I think, is why grasping the truth of 1915 in your hands is really important to the survivor community.
Thank you, Elyse. Building on this topic of prosthetic memory, I teach a feminist theory and methods course, and students often find your book to be one of the most groundbreaking, especially with regards to methodology. Could you tell us more about how feminist theory and methods informed your research and writing process? Did the theory and methods shape your research process, or did your source material shape your theory and methods?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, the material I'm using, some of it, such as the photograph of the tattooed woman, I mean, other people have discussed that source. I'm not the first person. But I saw something very different because of the method. So I did a lot of reading about the body and feminism. A lot of it was cut. We cut 100 pages from the book. So I had a lot of more theoretical meanderings that we decided to sacrifice just to kind of get to the meat of the issue, if you will. But I would say, yeah, feminist theories, I mean, just thinking about your work on femicide, for example, there's so much discussion in Latin America about femicide, about body territory, about, what's really happening, what kind of historical reverberations are being reenacted on bodies today. And so that's why I'm even more curious to read your book. I would just say, I think that we need to think about those issues in Middle East studies. And that means, indigenous feminism in the body territory theorization. It also means, for me, Marxist feminist studies like Gail Rubin's anthropology, where she looks at traffic in women in a completely different way than the League of Nations model of traffic in women, which is to think about these bodies are surplus material that can perform a certain kind of labor, maternal labor, and also domestic and field labor for the household. And it helps us understand why it is that they were a kind of capital that could be snatched when they were loosened up from the Armenian patriarchal household. I personally had never read anybody analyzing it in that way. But I would just add one more touch to this answer, which is that my earlier career was spent analyzing gender systems in the early modern period. And so what we can see is like moments of crisis where these older memories start to surface, such as whether we want to think about slavery and Islamic State in the 21st century, or think about enslavement and capture and abduction of women. There are long histories of those practices in the region that I think when the state's in crisis or society's in crisis, people fall back on those old memories and say, oh yeah, this is the way it really should be, right? Men should be able to kind of go out and capture women. And that was happening long before the Armenian Genocide. They were men, if they desired a woman and they had a certain level of societal power, they went out and abducted. And so there are many disputes about that in the 19th century between the Kurdish and Armenian community. for example.
So do you find that, and this is really a question more for maybe the graduate students who are with us here, did you find that you were kind of going back and forth between your source material and theory, or did you already have this like concept or certain concepts in your mind as you were going through your source material?
I would say I had concepts only because like you, I'm teaching gender studies, so it was hard to dislodge the two aspects. But what I felt like is that I could bring a different reading to some material. Like there are historians who have used these League of Nations records that I use heavily. Of course, there's other material. I mean, but some of it is also very easy to find. Like you can read a lot of tabloids about Armenian women and their tattoos, but you have to dive into Turkish language anthropology to find more analysis of those tattoos. So I think for me, the most important thing was that I was willing to be more theoretical maybe than I had before, and to take the risks or the dare, which is for all of us to take more risks. We live in a really difficult world right now, and I think we have to take more intellectual risks than we do.
Yes, absolutely. Another amazing risk that I thought that you took is your contention with the archive. So one of my favorite lines in your book is, "It is important to share with the reader that I have a bone to pick with the archive." Could you tell us more about this? Did you realize you had a bone to pick with the archive before or after you visited a dozen archives for this project?
Well, I, you know, what would I say about this? I was trained where you teach now, at Georgetown in a much more traditional way. We were always looking for access to the great discoveries, the great archival discoveries, right? This is how we were trained. And I loved that, you know. I mean, at one point I sat in the Syrian National Archives for 2 years. And I was, of course, looking for cases of prostitutes coming to court. You know, that was my goal. But the thing is, like, there's something about that drive, and of course, it's influenced by, you know, a quarter of a century ago, Derrida's archive fever, and there's been great work looking more critically at archives, thinking about Ann Stoler, inviting us to not think of the archive as a repository of knowledge, but to think of it as a subject that we should be researching, the construction of the archive. And then we get Rosie Bashir's great book, Archive Wars, to talk about the Saudi archive and all of the erasures, all of the power that's invested. This is, of course, how I think we should be viewing the Ottoman archives in Istanbul, the Başbakanlık Arşivi, which every Ottomanist wants to go to and train. And of course, people have found great material. I showed you an example of an abducted, unnamed Armenian woman. Okay, that's interesting. But I'm interested in her. Like, how do I get her story? I'm not going to get it from there. And maybe you'll find, you know, great material like property confiscation of Armenians. That's very important work. So I'm not dismissing the people who want to track that material and use that archive, but I do want to draw attention that there's a certain kind of effacement of the victim that happens in that type of archive, and that we should be naming it, and that of course we can still use that archive, but we also have so many more materials, including well, I love this move in the field now to use family archives. People have wonderful collections in their home. I mean, I just discovered one recently. I mean, there are people who actually are using those materials and, really importantly, reading those materials with the family members. And they're getting new information, but they also can offer information to the family. So thinking of feminism, how can we produce a more, I don't know, morally conscious approach to archive? And there are so many people working on that. So I think we could talk about archives all day, because many people are, in fact, getting more critical and thinking more carefully about how they use them. And I would just say one more thing. You know, some Armenian genocide studies, which I'm engaged in, it was all about finding, and it still remains for some people, to find the Ottoman documents that prove genocidal intent, the Ottoman state documents that prove like who's a perpetrator, who was involved to what degree. Again, I'm not dismissing that work, but it came at a cost where oral testimony was downplayed for decades. For most of Armenian genocide studies, we had the idea that, well, oral testimony it doesn't have the weight that the state archive does. And that gave what I call the perpetrator archive more, kind of more weight and bearing in the field. And that's what I think I see already, even among this new cohort of PhD students. They're correcting that, which I think is wonderful. Oh, I can't hear you. Is it your...
I tried to switch to headphones because of the echo, but it seems to not be working. Um, do you roughly remember what percentage of the photographs are from archives and what are from perhaps families roughly?
In my book? The photographs are largely from archives. So, I mean, I'm giving advice about going to family archives. I mean, only because I'm dealing with a family now and I'm very excited about it. But I didn't so much. And remember, some of this book was finished during COVID, so I had limitations. But I do think that there's a lot of collections in families, and I would say that there was a family of an unidentified woman. Her photograph I would show it to you, but it belongs to Getty Images, and I've already paid them. I don't know where this recording is going, but I've already paid them something like $3,000 to use photographs that have been, taken of these Armenian genocide victims. So to show you this, we would have to pay them $500 just to show you one photograph right now. But there is one it's been shown very frequently, of a woman whose chest is bared and you can see her tattoos. And she doesn't have a name, and the photograph was improperly cataloged to the point that the collector is named as the photographer. So I have a book chapter coming out about this, but it's actually a humanitarian photograph that through the family, I've been able to now name the woman. Her name is Miriam Azarian. So that kind of thing can happen when you have family members involved, which is really exciting to be able to put a name to a victim.
What you do with photographs and images in this book, I think, is incredible. And I was wondering, do you think that staged photographs of genocide victims also constitute another form of violence and erasure? If so, how does this form of violence and erasure compare to that of the archive? And how do you deal with it throughout the book?
Wow, that is a great question. Because again, if this weren't being recorded and posted anywhere, I could show you the image of Miriam, who I just mentioned. And in one photograph, I mean, she was an incredibly petite woman. According to the family members, even though she looked like a young girl, she was 21 in the photograph. And her frame is so tiny, I bet she wasn't even 5 feet tall. So in one photograph, she looks like a little girl, and she's completely modestly covered. Meanwhile, the posed photograph, and this was by a humanitarian photographer, taking the image presumably for maybe YWCA's magazine, because she was in a YWCA, pinned her dress open. If you look carefully, you can see the safety pins. And her breasts are partially exposed, which allows me to basically interpret the tattoos on her chest, while at the same time she's posing like an odalisque, like a traditional kind of, you could say like a Delacroix type reclining concubine. She's not reclining, but she's in this pose that is definitely doing violence to her as a woman who's already experienced sexual violence. So I think your question has embedded within it the answer, which is that this is a form of violence, and I've been struggling how to ethically deal with that. So I did publish this image without, I think, enough care in my book, but I'm re-engaging the image in an article where I actually have invited the family to reply with me. So I'm thinking of it as a different form of peer review, where the family are also my peers, and I'm borrowing from Zeynep Devrem Gürsel's Looking Together. She calls it. She has a book coming out on this, I just think that when we look at them together, the family can push back against my interpretations that they don't agree with. But what another thing the family has done, the descendant is an artist. I invited her to digitally manipulate the photograph. And so what she's done is, instead of having the open chest, it's now covered in a cloth, but the tattoos are embroidery on the chest. So she reinterpreted the photograph, and that's getting published in the article as well. So this book is called Afterlives, and it'll hopefully come out by the end of the year. But I just wanted to mention that I am also trying to continue to learn how to better, more ethically deal with this subject matter.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. Elyse, if you could just mute, because this one has a bit more context than the other questions. Thank you so much. So one of the things I love about your book is that you refuse to tell us a straightforward story. You show us how the narratives and bodies of survivors were molded to serve a cause. And I feel that you break this mold by capturing with raw honesty the conflicting emotions of women and children who were brought back into a reconstructed community after the genocide. Those emotions are really painful to listen to. And what's also painful for the reader is the way in which some humanitarian efforts re-traumatize survivors by making them relive their trauma in public to serve a cause. This shows up a few times in your book. So in light of this, I wonder, how have Armenians responded to your book, and how has writing this book moved you personally in the direction of recovery?
Wow. Maybe I'll start. Okay, so I'll start with, yeah. I mean, this is a book that doesn't want to shy away from the emotional aspect, and I think part of it meant I had to disclose something about myself, which I hadn't done before as a writer, to really talk about how little I know about my own family as a result of genocide. So I've always been very envious of people who know something about I mean, like, for example, like, even my grandparents' names, like, I only know them on one side and not the other. I really don't know, I mean, I'm sorry, my great grandparents' names. I really don't have much information about my family, but what I did have is a photograph. So I tried to talk about the only artifact that I have from my family that survived the genocide. And yes, there is a level of kind of, the experience of the writer, and it can be in some ways therapeutic if you think about Dominic Lacapra's working through trauma. Many people get in a more analytical mode to kind of process these emotions. I did want to tell a story that made people feel something, because I think we're really highly desensitized to violence. And so how to get people to feel something without veering into, well, what you were mentioning, which is how survivors were forced to tell, and sometimes in really sensationalist sideshow ways, like in the case of Aurora Mardiganian, who had to repeatedly reenact her trauma every day, for spectators as a sideshow act. At least that's how I tell the story, and I think it should be told in this way. So yeah, I mean, it's difficult emotional material, but I was hoping that, it would move people to feel something, and also to maybe reflect critically on our very sensationalist culture today, where we're inundated with images that we don't even have time to process. And yeah, I don't know if I got to a place of like recovery and healing, but I do feel really motivated to continue talking about difficult topics, because I think we need to continue to do so, especially as some of these forms of atrocities, whether we're talking about Sudan, or I'm also working on like Armenia, Azerbaijan, where there were many atrocities committed against civilians and mutilations. I mean, there's really no loss of material. It's kind of an ongoing thing. So trying to find ways to get people to engage rather than close down, I think, is the challenge.
I was also wondering, how would you describe, so you're touching on this and I want to maybe get you to talk a little bit more about it. How would you describe the emotional process of writing the book and how it shaped the intellectual process? Um, and I ask this because when I wrote a chapter in my book manuscript that deals with gender violence, I remember crying every day for 6 weeks, and I'm not someone who cries a lot. And I do feel it actually ended up being the best chapter of the book. And so I wonder that relationship between the emotional process and the intellectual process for you, if you could speak a little bit to that.
Wow. Well, I just would say I'm very well. I look forward to reading what you wrote, even though it sounds like again it was really trying. I have a lot of people that I was surrounded with who are actually working in things like death studies, which is another field I'm really interested in and want to continue to contribute to. Um, and so I think it's important to have people to talk to about it and also show some of the material too, to have other eyes on it. I don't know. I think something about being in a community while you're dealing with traumatic issues also helps, whether it's a community you're connected to personally or intellectually. So for me, it was really important, and I do think I remembered when I went through just the photographs for the League of Nations intakes, where they took photographs of people that had just been rescued in the actual clothes they were rescued in. And one of the things that struck me were just how many people were scarred, their eyes were bandaged over or missing. You could see like the damage on their bodies, especially since I was just kind of going through them quickly one day and I felt very quickly overwhelmed. So I think it's important that people who work on this type of work, seek help when they need it, from colleagues and friends, but also from professionals, and also sometimes take a break from it. I mean, there are a lot of friends I know that are working on, places we typically associate with trauma, but thinking about radical love and other types of things that kind of move us more into the activist element of it. How people are actually finding pathways to cope, deal, recover, in again disaster zones or places where you have like mass murder. So the resistance part, I think, can be an antidote as well.
I also got the impression that your empathy is what made the book so amazing. I think you tell the stories with honesty and empathy in a way that I think writers rarely do, and that's what, for me, what made your book so moving. Uh,
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, there was a person, Saad, who was somebody I had a kind of ongoing relationship with, who is from a very important tribe in the Deir Zor region, and I felt like I wanted to memorialize him in the book. As much as the Armenian genocide, I wanted to memorialize him. His grandmother was Armenian, and he had a certain narrative about, she was taken in and she was treated well, but she was like a second or third wife in this village. But the thing is, he died during the Syrian war, so in a way, I wanted to honor him by telling his story because he emphasized repeatedly how much he wanted his story to be out into the world, and he was holding on to these memories and wanted to share them. So, I mean, for me, those things are, I mean, he did in fact die during the Syrian war. So, I mean, but I felt some level of, I don't know, I mean, just a small sliver of hope, just being able to get his story out, which I knew was something he really wanted.
so my last question for you, Elise, what bone do you think you will pick with the archive in your next project? Have you
Oh God.
thought about that already?
Well, I just got back from Syria, where we're trying to reopen the Syrian National Archives. They're called Markaz Darwa al It was where I did a lot of my early research. And, um, you know, the thing is, like, broken states really don't have resources or sometimes necessarily the idea that archives matter, how much they matter. The head of the archives, Ammar al-Somar, said 2 weeks ago at the conference, you know, we're a nation without an archive. So there's the other side of it. What do you do when a nation doesn't have an archive? And thinking about what's at stake with understanding Syrian history, most of which is a mystery. First, people have only had their history scripted to them by the Assad regime. Second, people have no understanding of deeper history, even in our field. People are really bored by earlier periods of history. I'm currently, you know, working on some 17th century texts, and it's really quite joyous, actually, to see how people were living in earlier periods of time that might inspire us to think a little bit differently about, you know, what we might think works best. I mean, there are different models. I'm not saying we need to go back and live like the 17th century, but that we need a deeper sense of history to maybe invent something that works for us today. So yeah, Syria has no archive. It's closed. We're lobbying the current government to try to reopen it. But then there's the ongoing issue with some of the Armenian archives, which are controlled by the church. And I mean, again, I'm not gonna bash the men of the cloth that I have to interact with. Many of them are great intellectuals and scholars, but there's a highly protective culture around these Armenian archives. So getting access to the Armenian archives in Aleppo is currently my challenge, because I'm writing now the history of Aleppo, but trying to write about the city and its Armenian population. So bone to pick, mostly because these are not free and accessible places. And even when they are open, they're not always as transparent as you might think. They're imbued with power. So all those things kind of continue in different ways.
Thank you so much, Elyse. I want to open the floor for questions. We have one question. Could an international court ever formally recognize the Armenian genocide as genocide under international law, despite its pre-convention occurrence? If so, could such recognition set an important legal precedent for contemporary cases, such as alleged genocidal acts against Ukrainians, particularly in relation to the forced displacement and assimilation of children, Turkification and Russification? Before you answer that, Melanie, you came on camera and I wanted to see if you have something to say.
No, I just have a question and I can't write in the Q&A, so I'll stand in the line.
All right, we'll take you next.
I would just say, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so these are great questions for lawyers. And of course, there are some international lawyers who do believe that there's a pathway for, you know, international legal, you know, efforts with regard to the Armenian genocide. And there are some who would argue, probably very similar to this question, that those are just not the questions I'm answering, or that I'm answering in this book. Mostly because I'm not going to start from the premise of whether a genocide happened or not, when there's been just so much copious documentation of it. And in fact, the copious documentation begins even in American archives, not Ottoman archives. So that's just not, I don't want to sort of start in that place, which is actually where the Turkish government would like us to start with the conversation. Did it happen? Did it not? Are there legal grounds? Are there not? For me, the issues of post-memory move beyond any legal question. Plus, what has happened to the concept of genocide in terms of hyper-focusing on legal intent and sort of disregard of other forms of evidence, I think has been really atrocious. And the fact that also justice is so difficult to come by. I'm not arguing for justice, I think, in this book. I mean, the kind of justice that we will have is built between us, not states and not an international tribunal. In fact, I have done activism inside Turkey, and for me that's far more rewarding than kind of spending my time, you know, wondering about this kind of case. So, I mean, there are people, though, that have a completely different perspective. Armenians we can't agree with each other on most things. So there are going to be Armenians who say it must be a legal case, but I will tell you, Lemkin spent a lot of time talking about Armenians in his writings. He spent a lot of time thinking about the Armenian case along with the Shoah when he was developing his theory. So the question is, in his mind, it didn't seem to be a question. So why is it in ours?
Thank you, Elyse. Melanie, I think you have a question.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I know that you had to move sort of quickly through different parts of the book, but I was very compelled by a couple of different places where you talked about representation or the gaze vis-a-vis these histories that you're telling or the recuperation of those histories. You mentioned representation in photos and film in your body section that you had looked at, and then you mentioned the humanitarian gaze in this in the skin section. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the role that those kinds of mediated representations have played in how people understand their own memories, how they narrate their own memories, whether there's a kind of long tail of that kind of humanitarian gaze, for example, that still impacts people. I'd just like to hear a little bit more about the politics of representation of the Armenian genocide.
Oh yeah, I mean, although it wasn't heavily cited, Leila Abulughad's, oh, I love that you have a cat.
Sorry.
Leila Abulughad's Do Muslim Women Need Saving, which she wrote in response to this kind of harnessing of feminism on behalf of, the American war machine in Afghanistan, in particular with the Taliban. I think we have so many resonances of it in our everyday society. So I think the trick is how can we, uplift the voices of people who are being victimized without falling into these old, honestly, imperial and colonial narratives about rescuing brown women from brown men, to use Spivak's phrase from years ago, can the subaltern speak? And certainly there was some of this. I mean, Armenians were struggling to be, they were considered Asiatic in the United States, and we have now great histories being written that talk about the whitening of Armenians, like how Armenians had to argue legally to be white, and it's parallel to other ethnic groups in the United States. And how Armenian women were framed as white. I mean, they even lightened their skin to make the tattoos magically disappear through the magic of photography in order to show Armenian skin had been recuperated. Again, this was part, I think, of the list of delicious horrors that I think people enjoyed consuming. But what it did do that was positive for the Armenian community was create a public in the United States that knew about this genocide. And it was racialized, and it was also framed in civilizational terms. But in the end, there was a consciousness of this genocide that has since subsided. So it tells us also how vulnerable we are to certain discourses. That the humanitarian gaze can be very seductive and powerful, but very quickly, when new alliances were being formed, especially after World War II, the memory of the Armenian genocide in the United States was very effectively suppressed. And so the media has this power to make us hyper-conscious or make us forget. So that I was thinking about those sides, and like how it was not just Armenian post memory, but also American memories of all of this. Because if we talk to people who were consuming these media reports in the 19 teens and 20s, they would quickly say, "Oh, remember the starving Armenians? Finish your food." There was this Near East relief kind of slogan around the starving Armenians, and people absorbed it. In order to be more critical and to realize, of course, Orientalism played a role in how this genocide was presented to the American public, I did take a look at some of the images, even for Ravished Armenia, that portrayed a Turk looking very simian-like, and it was a play on other war posters, and also play on social Darwinism, of course.
Do we have any other questions from the audience?
Okay, I imagine that people are using their lunch hour, so maybe some people have to go, it looks like. But I just want to say thank you very much to both of you. That was a stunning presentation. I'm sure you'll find a lot of people anxious to go and get that book if they haven't gotten it already. Nefertiti, thank you for those really insightful questions. That was a really beautiful conversation, and I appreciate very much both of you being here today.
Thank you so much for your questions, Nefertiti, and for GW for having me.
And
Thank
the
you
book
for this
link is in
amazing
the
book.
chat. Thank you for the book. Yes, indeed.